Hello. I'm going to read to you some passages from a book called Time to Think by Nancy Kline, Listening to Ignite the Human Mind. This is a book that I'm still reading at the moment, about halfway through it, but it's got some really powerful, useful ideas, and I've been trying to apply them at work and in the family and just with people I meet and discussions and stuff, and it seems to be having a really amazing effect, so I'm hoping it can help you. Funnily enough, I was on a plane to Barcelona the other day, and I got on, and I was sat in the second row, the woman in the front row in the seat in front of me was also, I thought, reading this book, and I kind of said, oh, I've got the same book as you, and I got mine out and showed it to her, and actually she was reading the sequel, which I didn't realise existed, which is called Living with Time to Think, the Goddaughter Letters, which is some letters from Nancy Kline to her goddaughters about how to apply this stuff in your everyday life. But this is kind of a business book, but it also talks about family and personal relationships and stuff like that. It's really, you can apply it to anything. I'll stick some links to where you can get this from, and I'll stick the Goddaughter Letters in there as well. So I'm going to kick off with chapter 2, which is called Thinking for Yourself. Thinking for yourself is still a radical act. Thinking for yourself is not a popular activity, although it should be. Every step of real progress in our society has come from it. But in most circles, particularly in places that shape our lives, families, schools, and most workplaces, thinking for yourself is regarded with suspicion. Some institutions thwart it on purpose. It can be seen as dangerous. I was reminded of this sad fact when a fellow guest asked me about the subject of a book I was planning to write. I told him it was about how people can help each other to think for themselves. "Oh dear," he said, "I don't think much of that. I'd much prefer people to do as they're told." I later found out that he is the 4th generation president of one of the world's largest oil companies. When was the last organisational vision statement you saw that included the words, "To develop ourselves into a model environment in which everyone at every level can think for themselves"? For that matter, when was the last time someone asked you, "What do you really think? Really?" and then waited for you to answer at length? The dearth should not surprise us. Hardly anyone has been encouraged, much less trained, to think for themselves, and their teachers and parents and bosses weren't either, and neither were theirs. We may have learned to revere thinkers like Socrates, but we've also learnt that the state poisoned him for thinking for himself, not unmitigated encouragement. Occasionally, however, we do have a teacher or a mentor who truly wants us to develop our own thinking. They give us glimpses. When I was 13 years old, I was put into an advanced algebra course. On the first day, the teacher, who was maligned by students as a hard teacher because she tried to get them to think, stood in front of the blackboard and said, "On the paper in front of you, write the sum of a number." The entire class of 35 pubescent people just stared at her. She repeated the direction, "Write the sum of a number." I remember my hand gathering sweat around the pencil. A few heads looked down and their pencils started up. I wondered what in the world they were writing. I saw the girl across the aisle from me lean forward and peer over the shoulder of the boy in front of her who was scribbling something. Then she scratched a figure and immediately covered it with her hand. The teacher paced and rubbed the chalk between her fingers. I wondered what she was about to put on the board. I was now the only one not writing. I leaned back and over my left shoulder whispered to my friend, "What is it?" "7, she whispered back. So I wrote 7 on my paper. I kept my head down, hoping I looked busy and confident. After the agony among us had become tactile, the teacher asked us for our answers. The number 7 was prevalent. She walked slowly over to the board and wrote, "There is no such thing as the sum of a number." I knew that. "Why didn't you write it?" "Sarah said it was 7. "Why did you ask her?" "Because I don't know." "That's right. From now on, think for yourself." I was too scared around that teacher for the rest of my young life to think very well in her presence, but I took the message with me and gradually examined and valued it. I don't recommend humiliating people into thinking for themselves, as she had. She certainly did not create a thinking environment for us. Had she affirmed our intelligence first and spoken about the joy of thinking for ourselves, had she not fanned our fear of her, we would all have learned even more powerfully what it meant to do our own thinking. And we might have been able to think well around her too. But at least she introduced the concept into my academic life. That would not happen again for a long time, not until I was 17, when my English teacher required to write an in-class essay on one of the following two topics. How would you propose we restructure the lunch period? That's number one. Or two, what would change in the world if the men had the babies? She allowed us 30 minutes in which to do this. What would change in the world if the men had the babies? I thought she was kidding. She said she wasn't. This was in 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Nobody I knew for 1,000 miles on either side of that city was asking questions like that. The only explanation I can imagine was that my teacher did not like her periods and wished them on men, or perhaps that, contrary to what my mother said, my teacher could remember the pain of labour and childbirth and also wished that on men. I had no idea what she was getting at, so I wrote about lunch. It was nearly 30 years later before I realised that she'd asked an extremely important question. And it was to that memory I went back when I began searching for what to do to encourage people to explore their own thinking and to express it. That teacher set the choice before me to think about mundane things or big things, but in any case to choose to do my own thinking. There was no humiliation from her ever, and no judgment. I decided a year later that I wanted to be an English teacher when I grew up. Teachers, like those two women, are rare. It's unfortunate because even outside education, right inside organisations and workplaces and families, everyone could be a leader or mentor who sets things up for people to think for themselves. But typically, even when we're in groups that are brainstorming or exploring new ideas, often the unstated warning in the culture is, think the way others are thinking, think to impress, think to avoid ridicule, think to get a promotion, think to outmaneuver. We make fun of ideas that are too unusual. We avoid people whose ideas could be seen to be undermining the status quo, and by implication our own status. We also assume that the best help we can be to people is to do their thinking for them, to give them our ideas, to interrupt them and tell them what to think. As professionals, we have even been trained to do this, to see people as the experts on what people should do, to see ourselves as the experts on what people should do and think. Some people don't actually know what it means to think for themselves. I've worked with individuals and with groups who find the question, what do you really think, profoundly unsettling, even invasive. Early roots. The hugely bad habit of not thinking for ourselves and of making sure others don't still starts young. I saw it graphically in a group of teenagers on a leadership course I was running in London a few years ago. As we began, their faces were open, their energy high. I asked them to take turns answering this question. What was a time this year when you demonstrated some kind of leadership? Their faces slowly contorted. They looked at me as if I should explain. What was there to explain? What do you mean exactly? One of them finally asked me. So I tried to say it differently. What did you do this year that required you to take initiative or lead the way? Still no nod. Well, like, what sort of thing? Another asked. I don't know, I said. That's for you to say. Say what you think. How did you behave like a leader? Short silences like this are long. They stretch till they squeak. No one looked down or moved. I don't know what I did to lead this year, said one of the boys finally. Hey Jay, he said to the boy next to him. What would you say I did as a leader this year? Not much, said Jay, grinning. There was a collusive chuckle around the group. No, I said, the point is to say what you think. You are the only one who knows what you think about this or anything. Yeah, well, that's not as easy as you might think, said a girl called Bristol. Whoever thinks about this kind of thing anyway, I mean, it's not exactly your everyday question. You know, seems a little bit stupid to me. Who cares how I've been a leader this year? It's like, I'm not exactly on the news every night, am I? Some of the others giggled. Yeah, I agree, said another. Let's change the subject. This is kind of boring already. Is this what we're going to do all day? I knew I had less than 10 seconds to re-establish the morsel of credibility I might have had when they arrived. But I could not figure out what had happened. What could have made the question seem boring to them? Unusual perhaps, but boring? Then I remembered, boredom can set in because the person is disconnecting from the truth. These young people were doing exactly that. They were running fast from what they actually thought, trying hard to figure out what they were supposed to think. What, in other words, everyone else thought. It was as if their eyes were joined underneath the skull by another pair of eyes, like a kind of periscope, scanning the faces of others in the group to see what the right answer was. The right answer being whatever would not draw ridicule from anyone. The gingerly, almost illiterate dialogue that some were venturing with me was actually a sophisticated ritual of fitting in. It did not seem to occur to even one of them that thinking for themselves was a real option. Probably no post-war minefield could have been more threatening to this group of young people than this terrain between any one of them and the rest of the group. I suspect that when teenagers complain of being bored so much of the time, it's likely to be tied to the all-consuming activity of trying to be someone else. This is probably true for adults too. So I said, "When was the last time someone asked you what you think?" And slowly, they began to talk. I'll never forget what Lisa said. "No one's ever asked me that question. I do remember my dad saying not to get smart with him when I had an opinion. He said it was a sign of disrespect, and he had the back of his hand to prove it." Lisa and Bristol, like most people, went through their entire childhood and most of their teen years learning how to fit in rather than how to think for themselves. They said they did not want to be relegated to nerdhood. They did not want to lose their friends. As children, we learn to look to authorities to do our thinking for us. Then, from the minute we make friends, we look to them for what to think. Wherever we are, we look around, check out the scene and think what we imagine others are thinking, what we're expected to think. Even at graduate level, schools teach us ever more sophisticated ways of doing this. Most religions require it for salvation. In the corporations and governments and families that employ me as a consultant, I watch those 14-year-olds in the discussions. As middle-aged Bristols, they're looking around, they're sussing it out. What are they supposed to think here? What will keep them in favour with the people who hired them, who appraise their performance, who determine how fine a school they can choose for their children, who vote for the winners of professional prizes? Doing what everyone else does, thinking what everyone else thinks is rewarded. Some people tell me that they're afraid of their own thoughts, that they prefer just to keep on going rather than to stop and think about what they're doing. They fear the upheaval. They say that may result from finding out what they really do think. The status quo is safer. Thus, at this moment in human history, thinking for yourself is still a radical act. And until we decide that we must do whatever it takes to stop abdicating our thinking, until we see that our real survival depends on thinking for ourselves, we will look through those teenage periscopes in every meeting and every relationship for the rest of our lives. Thinking for yourself is the only reliable road to safety. Thinking for yourself leads to more happiness, not less. It offers more, not less respect between you and the people with whom you live and work and whom you love. People may tell you in subtle ways that doing your own thinking is dangerous. But what's really dangerous is to keep on not doing it. To keep tightening our vast minds until they cannot breathe constricts our society and our souls. If you dare to be radical in this way, to do your own thinking every day and to help others to do the same, lastingly good things will happen. Systems that we revere but are hurting us will be exposed and be replaced with better ones. Misunderstandings will fade. You will enjoy the fun of it. But given the misgivings people have about doing this thinking thing, this most natural and beautiful and necessary thing, we need the right